Welcome. I think this is episode 8. That's what I put in the title, but I don't actually know for sure. I'm assuming that this is going to go like how Bill's articles went when we first started the website. They were numbered originally, and then I just lost count, so I stopped numbering them. But this is TR Live, and I'm here with the usual crew John, Jeff, and William S. Lind. How are you guys?
We're doing well, but it's the Marines I expect to have trouble counting to 10, not civilians. Come on, Brad.
Well, I got a lot going on. You know, I can't be expected to count to these numbers.
We're going to ask Jeff to do the counting, and that's really going to get interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you ask Marines to count more than 10, we got to take our boots off and start using toes. So. In Columbus, we got a lot of snow, so I haven't seen snow in like 9 years because I've been away. So I took a walk through my neighborhood last night. It was really nice out, actually.
I was going to mention that we've got a lot of snow, and that's affecting my internet. So hopefully, I've already had some technical issues, so hopefully it doesn't plague us too much. If it does, I'll just bow out, and hopefully everyone else can just continue. So, I mean, without further ado, we can just get started. This week, the shutdown is really the main news point that's still ongoing. Trump had his primetime speech, and the media isn't really covering it. They're not really talking about it too much. Bill, do you have a take on this? What's going on?
Well, the shutdown at this point makes no sense. It needs to end because there is no way that a Democratic House is ever going to vote for a barrier on the border. As I said last week, this directly contradicts the Democrats' strategy, which they've been very public about, which is to swamp the votes of native-born Americans, whites especially, in a sea of immigrant votes. So Trump has to find another way to do it, and one is staring him in the face, and I don't know why he hasn't taken it. He does not need to declare a national emergency. That would be a mistake because that sets a precedent that the next Democratic president can also use, for example, on climate change, declare climate change a national emergency and bring the whole economy to a screeching halt with just a deluge of environmental regulations. What Trump can do, because he's the commander-in-chief, is very simple. Order the military to secure the southern border. Jeff will remember this is a story that every lieutenant in the Marine Corps knows. You have a lieutenant, a sergeant, and 6 Marines. They're given a task, put up the flagpole. You're the lieutenant. What do?
I don't remember.
You tell the sergeant, put up the flagpole.
Right. Got it.
And Trump is the lieutenant. The military, the JCS members are his sergeants, and he turns to them and says, secure the southern border. And how they do it is up to them. He has that authority as commander-in-chief. And he just says to the American people, I want to use our military to protect American territory and American citizens, not fight strategically pointless wars halfway around the world. And the public is going to be with him on this. And the Democrats in the House at that point don't matter. But the shutdown itself is pointless.
This is something I've said for a while. Like, why? He's commander-in-chief. Why doesn't he just do this?
Exactly. And it may come down again to the fact that he doesn't have the right advisors. He doesn't have people telling him, here's how you can do what you want to do. He has advisors trying to tell him, don't do that. Or, in many cases, sabotaging him. I've got a couple items here from this week's New York Times that are quite striking on this. From January 12th, their editorial, John Bolton's Wars, quotes a pro-government Turkish newspaper. It says, went so far as to accuse Mr. Bolton of being part of a, quote, soft coup against Trump, unquote. Well, that's in many ways a good description of what we've been seeing. We've been seeing the deep state carry out a soft coup where his commands are ignored, negated, reversed, etc. Of course, Bolton tried to do that in Syria. We're now being told equipment is coming out. Okay, that's a start, but I'm wondering if this is a smokescreen because other equipment's going in. President Trump, after his discussion with Mr. Erdogan, the head of Turkey, realized that we have very little time to get out before the Turks and the Kurds go at it. And we don't want to be caught in the middle. So we need to get out and get out fast. The Pentagon's doing everything it can to sabotage that in a soft coup. A similar piece from January 8th, New York Times on Korea gave a very striking example of this. Says another example of this was North Korea, where Mr. Trump decided to halt military exercises and informed the Pentagon afterward. Defense Department officials quietly continued the exercises, but just did not refer to them as exercises. Now, that sounds like kind of a soft coup to me. It certainly is the deep state in action. So
the entire Russian investigation is part of that entire coup as well.
yes, well, in fact, we're now learning just in the past week that if you're an incoming president or even a candidate for president who wants good relations with Russia, you're going to be investigated as a potential Russian agent.
Potentially, yeah.
This is absurd. Are we investigating presidents who want good relations with France as potential French agents?
Are we surprised a real estate tycoon wants to build a hotel in Moscow? I mean, is this so unbelievable?
Are we surprised that someone who is not a member of the Washington establishment sees that we want to have good relations with Russia and not view them as a potential enemy in a war that we're never going to fight because they're a nuclear power?
Right.
Trump is not about justifying the MIC, the military-industrial complex. Mm-hmm. So, of course, you have this, again, soft coup, and he doesn't seem to have any advisors who can tell him how he can bring his own intentions, his own agenda into effect.
Going back to the border, there's some folks that say that Trump could potentially use the Insurrection Act. How do you think it wouldn't set the nasty precedent of emergency powers, but it could potentially give him the authority to just take control and bring security to the border?
Again, he doesn't need to, and there's no insurrection. That would not stand up in court. An insurrection means you have an armed movement specifically out to fight the government. You have the drug smugglers who are armed and certainly have shootouts at times with the border patrol, but they're not out to have a war with the government. They're just out to get their stuff across the border. I think it would be a real reach to try to say that anything that's happening on the border is an insurrection. It is, however, an invasion. And that's where, as commander-in-chief, once again, he has not only the right, but the duty, according to his oath of office, to protect the country.
The fact that the Democrats are railroading him at every turn for this wall is enough to me. That's enough to call that an insurrection.
But that's a political insurrection. We don't want to forbid those because we are also insurrectionaries against the whole establishment politically.
Right.
We're not trying to bring in foreigners into our country, though, and that's what the whole Democratic Party is trying to do.
Oh, of course it is, but that still doesn't define an insurrection. That defines an invasion.
Sure, but what do you do with people that try to bring in invaders against, would-be combatants against us?
You stop the invasion. In other words, you prevent them from bringing the people in. Trump does not have the right, and this is fortunate from our perspective as well, to say that the Democrats can't take any legal means to try to win elections and take power. What's illegal here is the number of people crossing the southern border. And of course, the Democrats' plan, as they've shown many times, is to bring in as many illegals as possible and then amnesty them and get them on a fast track for citizenship so they vote. And that in itself, the illegal part is bringing the immigrants across. So I think we need to focus on what Trump has every right to do as president, which is secure the border against an invasion. and not try to get into areas that could easily be turned against us, because remember, at some point, there's likely to be a Democrat president in the future. And we would find these same tools immediately turned against us. That's why we don't want the declaration of emergency.
One thing that I thought about was that if Trump is able to go around Congress and secure the border, either by just placing troops on the border, or maybe he gets the wall, maybe he doesn't. But if he's able to go around them and do it anyway,
Yeah,
he still has the shutdown that he's standing firm on, and he's not getting anything out of it. So he really kind of looks weak. Do you think that plays into how his base will vote? Will they still be motivated to go out and vote for him?
If he secures the southern border, they will be motivated to vote for him. And of course, there are issues besides that also motivate them to vote for, particularly the fact that his opponent, whoever it is, will be someone who has utter contempt for the average American and is only interested in serving the coastal elites. So the base doesn't care how the border is secured, doesn't care whether it's a wall, whether it's a fence, whether it's flooding the whole thing or using nuclear weapons to blow a giant canal running from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It doesn't care how it's done. It does care that it does get done. And what I'm saying is our military is quite capable of doing that. You can design military engineering obstacles for the parts of the border that are trafficable, much of it is not, that are almost impossible to get over. These are very well known, in many cases, very ancient military techniques. And if necessary, you can cover the obstacles with fire. You have the right to use deadly force to protect a border. Historically, what's happened if you tried to cross a border illegally is you got shot. Simple as that. And that was true well up after World War II in Europe. So he's got the means, he has the authority, and he just needs to do it by telling the military, solve the problem, secure the border, put it on them. The public will be with him, and so will his base. Not just the base either.
Related, the media this week was gleefully reporting that the U.S. fertility rate is at a 30-year low. And of course, they use that as a reason for why we need more foreigners to import into this country.
Yes, obviously, this is the game we've been seeing in Europe for some time, and they're discovering that doesn't work very well because the foreigners turn it into a different country. I have a beautiful quote, again, from this week's New York Times, from today's, in fact, Sunday, January 13th. An article on how in Los Angeles they're now permitting street vendors. Well, as a foodie, that has its advantages. But it quotes one street vendor who was behind the legislation. We're talking about Los Angeles now. Quote, "Our city is Latino and we bring our cultures with us from other countries," unquote. Yes, they do. And as the Europeans have found, and as we are finding, those other cultures don't work nearly as well as the Anglo-Saxon culture, which has been the American culture of the public square since the colonial period. Some cultures work, most cultures don't. The two successful ones, really successful, are Western and Chinese. But what they're getting in Europe through the Muslim immigrants are cultures that don't work. Well, the reason we're getting this flood of people out of Central America is the cultures there don't work. And exactly as that woman says, they bring their cultures with them, whether they want to or not, because it's what they know.
Yeah, Senator Steve King from Iowa is under fire now because he's quoted as saying, or Congressman was quoted as saying, "Diversity is not our strength."
He's, of course, correct. Diversity, I mean, if that's true, the greatest power in Europe should have been Austria-Hungary. But it didn't quite work out that way.
Right. Well, really what they mean by this diversity is everyone's a different color but thinks the same thing.
Yes, their definition of diversity is in everything except ideas. But beyond that, the conservatives have always valued, for very good reason, community. Because community establishes and enforces standards without the government doing it. Does it much more effectively, and it does it without government coercion and government power. So if we want to uphold traditional values, morals, culture, we need community. But community forms much more easily among people who are like one another than in an area where you have diversity.
Right.
Diversity and community are opposed to one another. And from a conservative perspective, there's no choice. We're for community, which means we don't want diversity.
Right.
What the left really means by diversity is just less white people.
Yes, and less people who are Christian, Western culture, etc. It's the flooding strategy once again. It's to flood us in a sea of aliens and turn the United States into just one more dysfunctional third world country and culture.
Yeah, I don't think people appreciate the fact that America has, you know, rule of law. Like, not every culture created only really is the English who created the rule of law and transferred it to us. And Spain had the rule of kings, and then they transferred that to South America and Mexico. So when people see, you know, with all the crime rates, like 98% of murders in Mexico go unsolved, and they wonder, you know, why are people trying to get away from this? Well, it's because there's no sense of rule of law and justice in those countries. And that's what we were given from the English, who developed it over, you know, many hundreds of years of bloodletting and wars and what have you. But the English were smart because they pushed the Native Americans simply aside, call it as cruel as you want, but they said, we're not going to mix cultures. We're just going to move your culture away from ours, and we're going to establish our own thing. That didn't happen in South America with the Spanish and their, you know, colonizing. They were more about plundering it and taking it for good and bad as that ever was. But that's all.
They didn't. Instead of marriages.
Say it again.
The Spanish didn't bring any women with them, so they married the locals.
Right. Yeah, that's another big one. Yeah, exactly. They interbred with locals. Now you have all these, you know, different classes, and there's a caste system in South America and Mexico that's very bad. It's, you know, when you compare it to the United States. So I don't think people have an appreciation for that. And you look at like Puerto Rico. Oh, why is it so corrupt and destroyed? Well, because they got the rule of kings from Spain, and then you can see that Spain eventually was surpassed by England, who developed a better system of government and mercantilism, which Spain never developed mercantilism. They just had the king, you know, taking what he wanted. So it's underappreciated, but it's a big reason why, you know, English excelled and the Spanish eventually fell.
Well, even more fundamentally, what these cultures lack is any concept of civic virtue. And this is true of the Latin cultures, it's true of the Middle East, it's true of most of the world. You owe nothing to someone who isn't your relative. And so you trash up the public environment completely, nobody cares. You are only out to get as much as you can for your family, your tribe, your clan. And there's no sense of any responsibility to the larger civil society. It's Northern Europe that gave us the concept of civic virtue. And without a Northern European culture, we're going to lose that. And then again, this place is going to work like Mexico works. And it doesn't work very well.
Venezuela.
Yes,
Yeah.
Venezuela.
Yeah.
Well, that's especially bad at the moment because you take dysfunctional culture and add socialism.
And liberalism.
Yeah, well, no, it had
Yeah,
socialism.
cool.
This is
That's
going to
what I
be,
mean.
yes,
Yeah.
no, it is, that's nightmare. And it's creating huge refugee flows. Gee, for some reason, I don't hear the left crying about all the refugees from Venezuela nearly the way they're calling about all of the refugees from places like Africa.
Right, Somalia.
It seemed, well, perhaps they're white, that has something to do with it, but beyond that, they're fleeing socialism.
Yeah, you don't see many American refugees.
They're fleeing socialism, and that's a no-no on the left because no, socialism is the wave of the future.
Right.
So could we pop back to that article about the New York Times? You said that they were continuing military exercises?
Yes, which of course your book is about.
Right.
How worthless those exercises are, but
Right.
I'll quote it again. Defense Department officials quietly continued the exercises, but just did not refer to them as exercises. And of
That's
course,
the first I heard of that. I thought, are you allowed to just disobey the president? Like, that blows my mind because when he first, you know, said it, they're done. They canceled UFG, which is Ulchi Freedom Guardian, which is like a big computer simulation. I sat in on one. It was pretty dumb, but I was not under the impression that they were still going through with large-scale military exercises.
This one is what I'm saying. You see the whole executive branch, not just the military, simply ignoring the president, undermining him, subverting him, and he doesn't know what to do about it. And that's what makes him look weak. If he can't keep his own house in some kind of order, that confuses and dismays the base. There's no question about it. And the problem, as I've said before, is he doesn't know where to turn for people who think as he does. Non-establishment, anti-establishment people who nonetheless know how Washington works and know how to make things happen there, and can advise him saying, okay, here's your goal. Here's what you need to do to reach that goal. He seems to lack anyone doing that for him.
Bill, have you heard of or seen any of Scott Adams' stuff? He's the guy that created the Dilbert comic. You heard of him probably, but he's a huge Trump fan because he loves Trump's style of persuasion and what have you. But I read one of his books, and he puts Trump in this category. You just mentioned goals. He calls Trump a systems-based thinker as opposed to a goal-based thinker, because we're so force-fed and we expect politicians to have a goal that they're going to achieve, and they never know how to get there because they have to jump through all these steps to get to the goal, and then it ends up never happening. But then you have other people that are systems-based thinkers that just have a bunch of talents that they're using, but they figure it out kind of as they go along. So when you said he does, I agree with you. He's not doing what he came to do, but I do have some faith that Trump is in a way going to figure it out, because he's completely new to politics and to the presidential. He's completely new inside the DC political spectrum, really. So I have faith that he's going to figure it out, but I think we're prematurely disappointed because we're expecting someone to operate the same way that other people have done, but they never got any results. And Trump, despite some of the things that we don't like that he's doing, he has gotten results with tariffs, tax cuts, with fighting the trade war, with making countries pay more, ending some of the war. So he is getting progress, just not as much as in America as we always expect to see, because we're just so fed up with what's going on. So I have faith that things will change.
I think that may be true, that he's a systems-focused or systems-based person, but he doesn't know how the Washington systems work. He's had some successes where he's been able to push the executive branch, which hasn't wanted to do it, into doing some things on his agenda. But he has generally not been very successful with Congress, even when he had a Republican-controlled House and Senate. Of course, now it's a matter of getting a Democratic-controlled House to do things it doesn't want to do. There's a fine art to that. There have been presidents who've been extremely good at that, like Lyndon Johnson. They're generally not nice guys, by the way. But Trump desperately needs people who share his agenda, who genuinely want to help him accomplish what he wants to do, but know how to get particularly a Democratic House to do it against their desires. And that's one of the finest arts in politics, one of the most important political arts. How do you get people to do something they don't want to do? You have to be able to do that on Capitol Hill if you're going to get your agenda through. And I don't get a sense that he's learned much in that department.
Got it.
Going back to the culture question, we've got a question in the Landsberg. He asks, can the nation state of the USA even survive the loss of Anglo culture?
Well, I tend to think not. And of course, my book, Victoria, is about what happens when we lose our traditional Anglo-Saxon culture of the public square and the culture in which we relate to each other outside of our own particular ethnic clubs, churches, what have you. I mean, Cleveland's very much a city of ethnic groups, but in the public square, everybody is American, which means Anglo-Saxon. If we lose that, I do think the place comes apart. And what happens ultimately in Victoria is that if part of the former United States, we recover that old culture. But we have to always remember that contrary to the multiculturalist baloney, most cultures are dysfunctional. And we've had a very functional culture through our history. That's why we were able to turn a wilderness populated by a few million howling savages into the greatest nation on earth. We did it because not of our natural resources or anything like that. We did it because of our culture. And that was, again, English in origin, Northern European in origin, Anglo-Saxon culture. if we lose our culture, we will lose everything that culture produced for us and gave us, because it's all ultimately a product of that culture.
At the very least, you need to have a certainty for who you are. That's not negotiable. That's not a political thing. That's just who you are.
Well, and you need to have certain things that are absorbed from childhood. It's how you deal with other people, how you deal with the broader society. Again, concepts like civic virtue that most cultures don't have. And Northern European cultures have a very strong sense of civic virtue. But even in Southern Europe, that's missing, much less if you go on further south.
Yeah.
So the culture, this comes right back to the cultural conservatism that I was working on at Free Congress and put out a couple books on in the mid-1980s. And we said that if we lose the culture, we will lose everything the culture has given us. And that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, all the rights that we come to expect are from our Northern European culture. That's, we like to think that, they're just God-given, but no, they're just cultural expectations that we've come to, expect from we expect that the people around us respect. So we have a culture, we have a gun culture in America, and we've come to expect that we're allowed to keep and bear arms. But as the culture changes, that's no longer the case.
Well, and it's not even just rights. We have a basic expectation of things working. And that is Northern European in origin. In most of the world, things don't work. The mail isn't delivered, the telephone doesn't work, the electricity goes on and off, the street flows with sewage. Things don't work. And it is Northern European culture particularly that has given us a country where things work. And you notice, by the way, the more we lose that culture, the more we have things not working.
You think a lot of it's because we've basically turned laws into a way to legislate morality?
We've tried, and most of that legislating what's really a counter morality, if you will. Right. But when a society reaches the point that the cake of custom, as Russell Kirk called it, has decayed to the point where you're trying to legislate basic aspects of behavior like civic virtue, you've already lost.
Yeah, it's not meant to do that.
Right. It's a very clumsy instrument and a very ineffective instrument. And unfortunately, we are reaching that point. So what we need is the reaffirmation of Anglo-Saxon culture as the common culture. There's nothing to say that you can't be just like in Cleveland, where you have your ethnic church, your ethnic club, your ethnic festivals, which everybody goes to eat the food. So my immigration policies will take chefs from every country and culture, but no one else. We all like to get the different food. But in the public square, the culture is Anglo-Saxon. That's what the immigrants still coming to Cleveland from Europe believe very firmly. And they do their utmost as soon as they get here to absorb that Anglo-Saxon culture, and that's what they display in the public square.
It's
well,
almost like
the key is that they're immigrants from Europe.
Yes, of course.
Because no one else really seems to be able to reach that level.
The Chinese and Japanese can too, certainly have at times in their history. And those are functional cultures. But those are basically the only functional cultures. Every other culture in the world rises, falls, and never gets up again. The West has had a series of rises and falls, but it always does get up again. And China, culturally, has never fallen. If you look at something from Shang Dynasty China, you say, that's Chinese. The culture is remarkably continuous. It's as if we still had ancient Egypt recognizably with us.
They were fortunate their invaders let them keep their culture, and they kept those intact, basically.
They conquered the invaders with their culture because it was so superior.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think outside of the question of, can people from anywhere absorb a culture, I would say yes, they can. I mean, in the military, that was the method behind the madness. You take people from all sorts of different walks of life, and you say you will dress the same, you will talk the same, you will act the same. All those things are the same, and that's because similarity increases trust and cooperation, and culture influences behavior. And so military understands that, and as the military is being smacked with cultural Marxism left and right, where they're dividing us by race, by gender, by sexual orientation, by sexual identity, then the culture of the military is also beginning to suffer because of those exact same reasons, because we're not starting from this one same set of ideas and one set of principles that everyone adheres to.
Yes, when we had a draft, you had this acculturating mechanism because so many male Americans went through the military because they were drafted, and the culture in the military was very unabashedly Anglo-Saxon. So that was also an important acculturating mechanism. But as you say, Jeff, now the military itself is having to abandon that culture for essentially cultural Marxism, mainly because the senior leadership doesn't have the guts to stand up to it. And as a result, it's simply disintegrating as a military. We're very close to simply having a military that won't fight. We've long had one that's so outdated in terms of its way of war that it generally doesn't win, but at least it's fought. We're moving very quickly toward a military that will collapse at a touch. It simply won't be able to fight.
Right. Bill, what are your thoughts on, people say that democracies have, a lifespan associated with them. Are we just, in addition to the, cultural decay, are just a case of, like Thomas Jefferson said, democracies end once people realize they can vote themselves money. Are we just a product of that as well, where democracies have a lifespan associated with them, and they can only last so long, unless there's radical change? Is that occurring in your mind too, or is it mainly just cultural decay?
Well, yes, I think that's true, and it's true to a certain degree of societies as a whole. They rise, they fall. Most have trouble getting up again. Again, England has done a particularly good job of getting up again repeatedly. This seems to be a feature, particularly of Anglo-Saxon culture. But the fact is, we're not a democracy at this point. We're an oligarchy. And right. Where you see this most clearly is in this soft coup against Trump by the deep state. The deep state is owned lock, stock, and barrel by the oligarchy, and it is part of the oligarchy. And we call that oligarchy the establishment, and it includes both political parties, the majority of people in both of them, in Washington. And that, what you're seeing now is really a tussle, and I've just done a column on this that should go up probably in about a week, on the fact that liberal democracy is now a contradiction in terms, because the liberalism has become cultural Marxism. Democracy will reject cultural Marxism. We've seen this over and over again. The American heartland rejects it if it's given a chance to vote against it. And of course, it had that chance and elected President Trump. But then the oligarchy moves in and says, well, you're going to get it whether you like it or not, because we really run the show. So at that point, I think you have to say democracy is at least questionable, whether we are a democracy at this point. There's a way to restore it, and also I think to keep the country together as we do become more diverse, and as you have this cultural split between cultural Marxists and cultural conservatives. And that is by going back to the concept of federalism as it was in the early days of the Republic, under the Constitution. I'm not talking Confederation here, but essentially from the Constitution up till 1860, all the important stuff was left to the states, and there were great differences among the states. And I think you do still have a fair amount of democracy at the state level, because the state government isn't nearly so powerful. Among other things, it can't print money. So this is the conservative principle of subsidiarity. You want everything done at the lowest possible level. One of the reasons is you have the most democracy, the most popular input, the most power given to the popular will at the smallest level. In other words, the city of Middleburg Heights, if we had a town meeting government like they do in New England, would be very much a democracy. But by the time you get to the Washington we have today, there's very little democratic about it. However, I would say most of the states are still reasonably democratic. The problem is the federal government, the oligarchy, has taken all the power to itself, and the state governments are essentially left with very little authority.
Yeah, I thought about, and this is what you do kind of in your discovery of when questioning of, okay, what's the best system? What works best? Really, it comes down to what people make the system. And it goes from, the bottom up. It's not a top-down system. it may work that a state can run on it could be feasible that a state could function on a socialistic paradigm, possibly. Would it maybe be as good as, say, one's ruled by the people in, say, a Republican form? Probably not, as we've seen no evidence of a successful socialistic state. Most of the arguments that say why is that, well, they just didn't do it right.
And we would be happy to see them do it right, remembering that state governments can't print money. A socialist government that can't print money would be fun to watch.
True. Yeah, definitely.
The comedy alone would be worth it, the experiment.
Some of the congressmen that are elected definitely want to try.
There seem to be some of them. But the best government is the government that governs best. And what everybody pretty much agrees on at this point is, both here and in Europe, our governments aren't governing very well and haven't been for quite some time. And that's why you're seeing what's essentially a democratic rebellion against the establishment, the oligarchy, the deep state, and its globalist and culturally Marxist ideology. That's the big thing going on politically at the moment here, in France, almost everywhere.
Yeah. But
of course, the best government ultimately always comes from having a Habsburg emperor. They gave Austria 800 years of pretty steadily good government. I somehow don't think our republic is going to equal that. And there are lots of them, and they're looking for thrones. I mean, the opportunity is there.
They're fighting. There's a two-front war going on though in America, with the true right that's fighting neocons on one side and boomers on the same side, kind of, the Reagan, as long as we make a lot of money, we're good. And they're fighting liberals too. But then people on the left are fighting the Democratic base, and they're fighting us too. But really, a lot of times we have the same enemy. I don't know. I wish there could be a candidate, maybe like a Gabbard, that can maybe bridge the gap between, enemy of my enemy is my friend. I think that could possibly get some traction politically, but I don't think it'll happen because there's just too much animosity and no one can rise above it.
Well, as I said in our show last time, there's a political opportunity for someone to split the Democratic coalitions, because the blacks don't like the gays, the Hispanics don't like the blacks, the black and Hispanic men don't like the feminists. There are all kinds of fissures within the left's coalition that can be exploited and expanded. And I think it's possible to do that. It's possible to form a much broader conservative populist coalition. I don't see anyone on the political horizon at the moment who has the strategic ability to do that. But these kinds of opportunities usually call people forth, because you've got a lot of people out there who have the will to power and who are looking at opportunities like this and thinking, maybe I can do that. So it certainly wouldn't surprise me if such a person emerged. The opportunity is there. It is doable.
My hope is that Trump just declares himself Caesar. He doesn't have to use emergency powers or anything. And then we can be done with democracy and oligarchy.
Well, remember, after Caesar, who was not terribly successful, comes Augustus. And that's what I'm waiting for. We may, if we're lucky, end our Republican experiment with an Augustus, who was the greatest of all Roman emperors, and who ended the civil wars that had come to plague the Roman Republic, and that again somewhat prefigure the scenario I lay out in Victoria.
Very good. So earlier this week, a girl named Jamie Kloss was found in Wisconsin after being missing for a few months. She was abducted from her home. Her parents were killed last year, and she was found alive. This led some people to investigate a little bit more about her, and they found that the town where she's from, Barren, Wisconsin, went from 2% Somali to 25% Somali within the last 10 years. And this is a town of just 3,500 people. So what is a community to do when they're just being overtaken like this? I mean, this is frankly a nightmare scenario. What can people do about this? Is there anything people can do about a situation like this?
Well, the person accused of the murder of her parents and her kidnapping is not Somali. However,
No.
Somalia has a very violent culture. And if you bring in people, as I've said repeatedly, from a culture like that, they bring their culture with them because it's what they know. There is no reason there should be any Somalis in this country. It is bizarre that they are here. And the American Conservative actually had a cover some years ago entitled The Great Somali Welfare Hunt. And the reason they ended up in places like Wisconsin and Minnesota and Maine, Michigan, by the way, yes, is they sat down and studied where can we get the most free stuff? Where can we get the most stuff from white Americans' taxes? And that's where they went. So it is absolutely absurd that we're bringing in people from very violent cultures, knowing that we're importing violence and doing this. And if you live in one of those towns, all you can do is get out. That's the reality. Because the cultural Marxist will label you another Hitler if you try to fight back in any way. Even though I wouldn't probably want to be living next door to a Somali if I were Jewish.
It's funny you mentioned that, because at the place where I work out, the Jewish Community Center, some of the guys in there and I were talking the other day, and a few of them admitted it. It's Jewish Family Services and Catholic Relief Services that are the main ones bringing Somalis to the United States. And I asked one of the guys, I'm like, you realize that you're bringing people here that hate you. Are you okay with that? And he's like, no, I hate it. The United Way called me asking for money to help these people. And I said, no, like, I was at Kroger the other day and the Somali threatened me because I'm Jewish. And I said, well, there you go. Like, why are you bringing in people that hate you?
But he's absolutely right.
Yeah.
He's absolutely right. It's Jewish Charities and Catholic Charities that are doing this. I mean, at least one would hope the Catholic Charities would focus on Catholics, not people who hate Catholics and want to give them all the choice between conversion or having their heads cut off.
Yeah, they've got problems with legal battles with the pedophilia going on as well. So they've got other problems.
Yes, well, that's a long story in and of itself. So in any case, it's absurd we have these people here. It's like when we had the bombing of the Boston Marathon by a Chechen. The first thing that occurred to me is, why are there any Chechens in the United States? As any Russian will tell you, Chechen isn't a nationality. It's a profession of criminality.
Sounds Russian.
Well, I'm quite willing to welcome Russians, but Chechnya is mostly Muslim, and Russians, of course, are Orthodox Christians. And Chechnya has been known since the mid-19th century as an extremely violent society, as it still is. So why are they here? This just shows the absolute disconnect from reality that typifies the Washington establishment and the people who make these policies. They are totally disconnected from reality, and they're operating, of course, on the basis of their ideology of cultural Marxism, which says all other cultures are wonderful, peaceful, vibrant cultures, except white culture, which is evil and oppressive. Our own culture.
Yeah, the white guy's proud of himself. Look out.
Yes. Yep. But everybody else is supposed to be proud of themselves.
Jeff, you had a news item that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, it had to do with the Korea situation. So this is in the Columbus Dispatch this Sunday. U.S. South Korea at an impasse over military funds. So Trump administration is actually finally going through with what he asked for. You know, not in addition to NATO, he's asking Korea to pay more. So U.S. negotiators have sought a 50% increase in Seoul's annual payment, which last year was about $830 million, or about half the estimated cost of hosting the 28,500 U.S. troops. So talks that began on March, a 5-year funding agreement were suspended after negotiators did not agree on a new rate by the end of 2018. So the Koreans just want to keep the status quo. I'll just do a quick, if people think that, South Korea needs, our military assistance, just do a quick screen share of military strength. Can you guys see this?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the Global Force Firepower ranking of 2018 military strength. So they just rate countries. A lot of things go into this. How much oil can they produce? How many men do they have that could be put under arms? Their equipment, their level of training. So, big surprise, the United States is number 1. Go down the list here a little bit. South Korea comes in at number 7. And so they're beating out countries like Japan, countries like Turkey, who has the second biggest army in NATO, actually, and then Germany, who can only get 3 of their tornadoes in the air. Down here at number 18 is North Korea. So an island nation like Indonesia and Israel, 6 million strong, is beating out, the big bad North Koreans. And so this article also states that in the latest spending bill, Congress barred the Pentagon from reducing troop levels in Korea below 22,000 unless the president certifies to Congress that it's in the interest of national security. I've been to Korea a couple times. I could tell you that place, his infrastructure is first world. I have never seen such nice stuff, airports, roads, like Trump said during his campaign. And right here where I live, on James Road, some of these, our roads are horrible. So the fact that we still want to be spending the amount of money we're spending in Korea is just pathetic to me. So I don't think anything's going to change. Just the Congress holds the purse strings, and we have to, keep our empire.
Well, it's been absurd for us to have forces in Korea since the Cold War ended. Korea was only of significance to us because of the international confrontation between so-called free democracy and communism. But when that ended, the whole Korean peninsula lost all strategic significance for the United States. It's significant to Russia, to China, to Japan, but it isn't to us. And yet, how many years ago was that? And we're still there with 20-some thousand troops who are merely hostages, in effect? This is pointless. It's absurd. And the notion that we are spending American taxpayer dollars to subsidize what, you're right, Jeff, is at this point a first world country, is even more absurd. But beyond the financial absurdity, it's even more absurd strategically. And it's part of this business that says nothing that can happen anywhere in the world can happen without the United States being a part of it. And that's, of course, the Washington establishment, because that's how it justifies budgets and builds careers. And it's purely to the benefit of the oligarchy. It is at the cost of the rest of the country.
Yeah.
The last serious bit of news I have is that the U.S. has started drawing down its presence in Syria, despite last week we talked about the conditions that were supposed to be placed on it, namely that Turkey was supposed to promise that they won't attack the Kurds, but we are in fact drawing down the presence from Syria. And also, it was announced today, right before we started the show, I saw the news article that the White House asked for military options for a strike on Iran at some point last year.
That would be highly unfortunate. The president was elected to end stupid wars halfway around the world, not to start another one. And if he wants to lose a big chunk of his base real fast, it will be by starting another war in the Middle East against a nation that's a lot stronger than Iraq and that controls much of the routes, or at least influences much of the routes through which the world's oil flows. This would be really dumb. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen. And President Trump will shatter his coalition if it does. I'll put it that way. Because a lot of us who voted for him because he was the peace candidate against Hillary, who was for intervention everywhere. If he throws that out the window and starts another war, we're not going to vote for him again.
No, you better believe I'm voting for Tulsi Gabbard.
You're voting for who?
Tulsi Gabbard.
Oh,
yes.
Absolutely.
It's going to be hilarious to watch the Democrats and their new neocon allies attack her for her anti-war stance. I mean, it's already happening as we speak. They're finding tweets that she had in 2000 coming out against gay marriage. I mean, they're firing on all cylinders to take her down before she even gets off the ground.
That would not surprise me. It's also just going to be hilarious watching this enormous Donnybrook as you've got 20 or 50 Democratic candidates savaging each other for months before the primaries even start. It is going to be a real Irish brawl and great fun to watch from the sidelines. I have a couple small items, Brent, one not so small. A little bit of good news, New York Times, again, January 9th. European nations join forces to block rescue ships. These rescue ships were a virtual ferry service picking up Africans in huge numbers who just had to get slightly off the coast of Libya, and these rescue ships would pick them up and ferry them to Italy and dump them, where now the Italian taxpayer is supposed to take care of them. And suddenly the European countries in the Mediterranean aren't taking the ships anymore, and their numbers have fallen from over a dozen down to just 3. And hopefully that will soon be 0, because they'll have no place to land. So
well, last I saw, Spain was still taking them. So does this
Spain
include
has
them?
a socialist government, but even there they're running into problems. And some of the Spanish provinces are beginning to say, wait a minute, the provinces where these ships dock and vomit forth their cargo onto Spain's shores, again, to be taken care of by the obviously very wealthy average Spanish taxpayer.
Unemployment in Spain is like 25%. I'm not exaggerating. It's like 25%.
Spain does not need more poor people, especially poor people who won't even speak Spanish. And then occasionally the left lets its horns and tail show. And the New York Times did on page 1 on January 7th with an article, the title of which is, get this, Divorces Show Women's Gains in West Africa. They're arguing that obviously this is getting much better for women because the divorce rate is skyrocketing with women demanding divorces. And they start off saying, he didn't hit her, he didn't yell, he didn't cheat as far as she knows. It was just less than 2 years into their marriage. Zulika Amadou's husband had changed. And she was a young woman who expected, well, more. Her mother was appalled. Her mother said it's the end of the world when a husband and wife don't stay together. Well, yes, of course, she's right. But the fact that the Times would cheer because divorce rates are soaring just shows how morally evil the other side really is. There's no other word for it. This is morally evil, given the consequences to all parties, especially any kids, of divorce.
Never mind illnesses everywhere. There's there's hardly any plumbing. There's there's infected groundwater. There's all these other problems, but man, they were progressive. And
women's life is improving despite the fact that they don't dare drink the water, and their kids die like flies and so forth, because now they can easily get divorces. Yes.
The exception is the rule.
The divorced woman, as she ages and loses her looks and therefore her marriageability, is generally a pretty sad figure even in this country. What's it going to be like to be one of those women in West Africa?
Not pleasant, I imagine.
So I'm going to go ahead and ask the obvious question. Why do we care about marriage in West Africa?
Well, I would just as lief see West Africa do as well as West Africa can, which isn't very. And I would just as lief see the societies there be as functional as they can be, which isn't very, than have them deteriorate even further into complete anarchy. Anarchy isn't in anybody's interest. Among other things, it generates tons of refugees who people will then be trying to smuggle into Europe. So I would be just as happy to see those areas be as stable as possible and make what little progress, given their defective cultures, that they can. And certainly to just cheer about rising divorce rates. I mean, that headline got attention in hell, because the devil was definitely licking his chops over the people who think this is a wonderful thing, that the divorce rate is rising. And then I have 2 ideas, and it'll conclude this show for me at least. I mentioned in a previous show, one of our big problems is the export of jobs through outsourcing jobs. And this is hitting white collar, not just blue collar people now. Trump has brought back tariffs, which is great. We need more of them. But in addition to import tariffs, countries used to have export tariffs. Well, what if we put a duty, as they were called, a tariff, on the export of jobs that was in each case the value of the difference between what they had previously paid the American and what they're now paying the foreigner in India or someplace like that, plus 10%. I tend to think we would see a lot less outsourcing of jobs. And we're going around the world hitting everybody in the middle of the night with tomahawks and Reaper drones and all of this sort of stuff. But we do nothing about a curse that affects every American every day in his own home, robocalls. Now, if it were up to me, I would be happy
the real problem in the world
to drop some cruise missiles on robocall centers in India and places like that. We're probably not, unfortunately, to that point yet. I'm saving that, I hope, for Trump's second term. But in the meantime, I think there would be a practical way to reduce robocalls. Remember the old rule: if you want less of something, tax it. I would put $1 a call tax on all robocalls to be paid by the telephone company that delivers the call. Do you think the number of robocalls would drop dramatically rather quickly? You can't tax the company placing the call because it's overseas. But if the tax has to be paid by whatever company lets the call come through to your home, then I think we would see a very sharp reduction in the number of these scamming, lying, cheating, illegal robocalls that plague us. This is what I call creative government. And conservatives used to become good at creative government. I don't know why we've lost it, and I see no reason that we shouldn't bring it back.
Now they're making money on the robocalls.
They probably are, yes. So those are my items for our little version of That Was the Week That Was. Okay.
I have a couple more little less serious ones. The experiment the Air Force conducted this summer is looking like it's going to move to a attack. The Super Tucano, the Texan 2, there were a couple others that I'm not remembering, but they're just turboprop, light attack, like counterinsurgency, close air support.
AT-6 probably. I think they tested the AT-6.
Yeah, I mentioned that.
I didn't hear it.
I think there were two more, but
be careful on this.
I'm just not remembering them right now.
Be careful on this, Brett. Dan Grazier, who I know very well, I knew him as a Marine captain, is now with the Project on Government Oversight in Washington and is putting out some excellent stuff, particularly on the F-35. I think he's right to caution that this whole program may be a red herring. The Air Force may be doing this until they can use it as a justification for getting rid of the A-10, the only really effective ground support aircraft in the American inventory, which they've hated from day one because they don't want to do that mission. And as soon as the A-10's gone, they will cancel the light attack program. And so all you'll have left is the flying piano, the F-35, which is a joke in any role in which you want to use it, much less close support. So I'd be very leery about this. As somebody who's been in Washington and seen it from the inside, I get a strong red herring and dead herring smell from this whole program.
I'd like to see. I think we're all in agreement. We'd really like to see the light attack program go through. What really interests me is just how capable of interdiction the platform would be, and not just close air support. And that kind of gets into the maneuver style of aerial warfare that American armed forces have never really been able to execute. But the Soviets and Germans were really good at.
Yes, well, you get into a mission, it's not interdiction. Most of what the Luftwaffe did was not close air support. It was armed reconnaissance in support of the Schwerpunkt. Now, you had situations like when you're crossing, when Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps was crossing the Meuse at Sedan. Yes, that was very much close air support. And the goal was to, which they were successful, was to keep the French artillerymen away from their gunners, because the strength of the French army was its excellent artillery. And the main thing likely to prevent the Germans getting across the Meuse was the French artillery. But a great deal of what the Luftwaffe did was armed reconnaissance in support of the Schwerpunkt, where they were going out in front of the main German spearhead and attacking targets of opportunity particularly with the goal of preventing the French from moving operational reserves on the road. The Red Air Force did the same thing. The Sturmovix, which were very effective ground support aircraft, focused on delaying the Germans' movements of operational reserve. They understood that was the rapid shifting of operational reserves was key to the German defense. So it wasn't so much to destroy, it was to slow down. We did the same thing in Normandy. Over the objections of at the time, the Army Air Force, we put in a lot of fighter bombers that were launching attacks, strafing attacks, and so forth on all those German columns as the Germans were trying to shift divisions. It didn't destroy a lot, but it slowed them down, and the time difference was critical. So that's what I call armed reconnaissance in support of the Schwerpunkt, and that is probably the #1 mission we need from an aircraft like this, with actual close air support, #2.
Yeah, absolutely. The last bit of news I have is that Russia is set to import more T-34s this year than it will buy new T-14 tanks.
Well, the T-14, from what I hear, is having a lot of problems. The reason they're bringing back the T-34s is not to use them against NATO, though they probably work just fine, especially against an army full of women and transgender. In fact, probably you could have papier-mâché tanks and they work just fine. But they're doing it because the T-34 was in many ways the basis of the Soviet victory in World War II. Without that tank, and that tank building enormous numbers, at least 80,000, maybe over 100,000, when the Germans were producing maybe 5,000 Tigers and fewer than 10,000 Panthers, it was a brilliant tank design. It was very crude. It was very simple. It was easy to produce in vast quantities, but it was just a brilliant design. It was probably the most effective medium tank of the war, despite its crudeness. So the Russians know this, and as they hearken back to their great victory in World War II, and we tend to forget, the most important Allied power in World War II in Europe was not the United States, much less Britain. It was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union won the war in Europe. If at Normandy we had been driven back into the sea, I personally think the war would have ended with the Red Army on the English Channel. I think that the Germans at that point, summer of '44, had already lost to the Reds. So this is a matter of tremendous pride in Russia today, and the T-34 is the symbol. So of course they're bringing them back. They're bringing them back as part of a resurrection of pride in Russia, and I don't blame them.
Well, I was hoping you'd say that, of course, they're importing them because they're going to refurbish them and then give them to Victoria.
Well, that happens in my novel, and the reason it happens is because they're very easy to maintain. Anybody can make them run. They have one at the Armor Museum attached to Fort Knox, and when I was down there one day, they said they'd had this was in the Soviet period, had some Soviets visiting recently, and they asked them, they said, "We have a problem with our T-34. When we start it up, it covers the whole wall behind it in oil. What do you do about that?" And they said, "Oh, they all do that." And I said, "They do? What do you do about it?" They said, "We pour in more oil." Very Russian solution. The Russian solution, if the tire goes flat, you stuff it with straw. The Russian is the only man who will chase a rabbit in an ox cart and catch it. So the T-34 is perfect for Victoria. It's easy to maintain, and in Victoria, we're smart enough militarily to know our tanks aren't to be used against other tanks. We have anti-tank weapons for that. The purpose of tanks is to break deep into the enemy's rear and roll him up from the rear, overrun his logistics, his headquarters. The most important gun on a tank is the machine gun, not the main gun. So the T-34 is absolutely perfect. And it was a very wise Tsar, and the Tsar has been restored in Victoria, who sent us 100 T-34s.
So, Bill, now that we've mentioned it, why don't you mention your book Victoria one last time, and then tell us about your other books.
Well, Victoria is my novel done under the name Thomas Hobbes because it is a updated version of his 17th century book Leviathan. which, as Martin Van Crefeld has pointed out, is the book of the internal theory of the state, as Machiavelli is the theorist of the state's external relations. This is looking into our future. It is unfortunately the path we're on, because Victoria is a warning. After this country in 50 years breaks up in fourth generation war. But it's also the story of how in part of the former United States, the Northeast, which becomes the nation of Victoria, we restore the old culture. We literally return through a movement called retroculture to the Victorian period because it worked. And I have a book coming out this quarter called Retroculture, which is essentially a book on how you in your own life, your family's life, perhaps even in your community, can start taking our life back to the way it was when things worked, which is to say before the disastrous decade of the 1960s. And for those more interested in warfare per se, I have the book I've done with Greg Thiel, Lieutenant Colonel Greg Thiel, U.S. Marine Corps, now retired, the Fourth Generation Warfare Handbook. And this is written more for practitioners, but it's not a technical book, and I don't think the average person would have any great trouble understanding it. It would be particularly of interest, I would think, for law enforcement, because more and more of them realize they're facing not just crime, they're facing fourth generation war, particularly from gangs. So those are my books, and Jeff has one to talk about as well.
Yeah, so my book, American Cobra Pilot, we were talking about military exercises in Korea. So there's a cover of my book. But just a quick little snippet. It centers around an exercise we did on my first deployment, but I pasted in a email with names redacted from our executive officer. He's talking about Operation or Exercise Sangyong in 2014, which is a MEM level exercise off the coast of Korea with South Koreans. So it's we were told right before the exercise began, everyone needs to realize this is not a tactical exercise. This is a political exercise to show that even in fiscally constrained times, we, Uncle Sam, can still throw together a dozen ships and do a beach assault with all of our toys. What actually makes it to the beach is mostly irrelevant. So I have some pictures in here too that kind of make fun of how stupid this entire exercise was, because we were told from leadership that the exercise didn't matter. Just put the dogs and ponies in the water for a couple hours and take some pictures and call it a day. So it was basically Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, but in modern American terms. So it's a funny read. It's satire. So I'm making a point by making people laugh.
I think, could we call it Triumph of the Swill?
Yeah, that would be good. I chose the cover first, and then I was like, well, I gotta have a subtitle that has something dog in it. So Dog and Pony Show worked just as good. That would be funny.
I said you've got the two smartest Marines in the Corps on the cover, but I want to give them each an IQ test and see which comes out number one.
Yeah, I think the Harrier one will probably beat me. Yeah.
Great. So remember, if you want to interact with the show, you can comment in the live chat or send us an email at traditionalright@gmail.com. If you have a comment or a question, I can read it out loud on the air, and we can address it. We can answer your questions, or we can just read your comments. And we like to have interaction. It makes it more fun for everybody. Thank you for joining us again. I think, Bill, you're out next week, so we may or may not be. Say again?
I will be in sunny Southern California as Cleveland goes into the deep freeze.
It's a good place to be.
Yeah,
so
it's a strategic retreat.
We'll have to decide if we're going to be on the air or not. I'm thinking not. We might have an off week next week. So thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you again in probably 2 weeks. Take care. Have a good night.
Thanks. See you.
Good night.
Thanks for listening.